Welcome everyone to this book launch webinar on philosophies of work in the Platonic tradition. Thank you all for participating. I'm Tyler Vanderweel, the director of the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. I'll make a few brief remarks on the program and then introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jeffrey Hanson. The Human Flourishing program at Harvard was founded in 2016 to study and promote human flourishing and to try to develop approaches to the integration of knowledge across disciplines. We have a number of different research themes, including meaning and purpose, friendship and family, religious communities, character formation. But one of our themes is on work and well-being. Most of us spend a great deal of our lives working, and work affects our well-being in life in numerous ways. It has the potential to contribute and the potential to detract. It is consequently an important topic, both for empirical inquiry, but also for philosophical reflection. And Dr. Hanson has spent a considerable time over these past years trying to understand, synthesize, and bring together various philosophies of work. So delighted to have him here today to present some of that. Dr. Hanson received his PhD from Fordham University in 2004. He served on faculty at Boston College and Australia Catholic University before coming to the Human Flourishing program in 2016 as our senior philosopher. His areas of specialization include 19th and 20th century continental philosophy, phenomenology, philosophy of religion, philosophy of work, and the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard. He's published 6 books and over 35 articles on these various topics, and he's contributed enormously to our program's research and scholarship on work, on meaning and purpose, on forgiveness, on interpersonal love, and of course, in his scholarship on Kierkegaard. On a more personal note, this project on the philosophy of work was really one of the first of the program. Jeff began this really when he started with the program. The topic itself is, of course, vast. To my knowledge, this is the first book on the history of philosophy of work, and I think some of that is because of the vastness of the topic. So Jeff has done really an extraordinary job of pulling together these various philosophies of work within the Platonic tradition, trying to synthesize, make sense of them, and help us to understand the contribution of work to life, to human society, to human flourishing. So with that, I will hand things over to Dr. Jeffrey Hanson. Jeff.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much. Sorry about the difficulties. We've solved them the old-fashioned way. And thanks, Tyler, for that generous introduction, as well as for letting me sit in your chair. So here I am. Let me just say a few words, as Tyler's asked me to do, on the contents of the book, just to acquaint you with what you might find if you were to give it a thorough reading. I start in the introduction with what I thought was a telling vignette that came from the presidential debates in 2015, when Senator Marco Rubio made a remark about how he felt that society should be cultivating more welders than philosophers, right? He said we had a deeper need for welders than philosophers, and that we should enhance the value that we attribute to work of different kinds. And I thought it was interesting that the then president of the American Philosophical Association defended the value of philosophy in terms of its sort of earning potential, right? You know, she countered Senator Rubio's call for more welders with an argument that philosophy, in fact, prepares you very well for a variety of careers, and that philosophers make more money than welders in the end. So this struck me as indicative of a kind of a problem that we have in our culture, which is deciding how to really assess the value of work and its importance. And so I turned to the Platonic tradition, in part because I think it's an interesting set of resources for addressing that question, right? In the Platonic tradition, we find that work is valued, but never really regarded as supreme. And so I think that basic orientation allows us to avoid a couple of extremes that I'll circle back to at the end of my remarks today, and that I come back to at the end of the book as well. Everybody admits that work has some external goods that it makes available, right? Chief among them, things like the provision of our needs, right? And the provision of a paycheck. But the authors that I studied in this book also reflect on the internal goods of work, what makes it worth doing, not just for its rewards, but also in itself. And I think most of these authors are comfortable with the recognition that both of those things can be true of something like work at the same time, right? It can have internal goods, things that are worth pursuing about it for its own sake, as well as external goods, right? Things that it brings along with it that are of genuine benefit. So let me start with just talking about some themes that appear first in Plato and then come up again and again in the course of the book. So for Plato and for the tradition that follows him, practice is always subordinate to theory, right? But this makes work as sort of a distinctly human practice something that's responsive to reality, a reality that we know through theorizing. Plato depicts his hero and teacher Socrates as perpetually in search of knowledge. And in the Apology, Socrates says in his search for knowledge that he was quickly convinced that the poets, despite the respect that his society accorded them, don't really have knowledge. And that politicians, despite the fact that they are more or less in charge of his society, also don't have knowledge. But he's convinced that craftspeople do have knowledge. And so this leads me to think a little bit about Plato's take on techne, what they would have called it in Greek techne, which is craft, right? And it's the sort of thing that most ordinary people did for what we would call work. So some commentators don't want to admit this, but Plato really does think that philosophers are not the only ones who have knowledge. Craftspeople also have knowledge, but their knowledge is bounded, right? It pertains to a limited aspect of reality as a whole. And debates have raged in scholarship over how exactly to understand Plato's obvious appreciation for techne. So the view that I develop in the book is that for him, techne is not so much a model for how to understand philosophy as some have held it to be. And in fact, he defines philosophy really for the Western world in the first instance. But that for him, techne is a part of the whole of knowledge that philosophy is concerned with. For Plato, and this is true of just Greek thought generally, a techne is an area of science or knowledge that concerns itself with a definite aspect of reality, and it solves a definite problem. So he thinks that we have medicine because our bodies fall ill. We have things like cobbling and tailoring because our bodies need protection. And what most people do for work has this very first and obvious benefit, that their work remediates a definite human problem or shortfall. For Plato, the good of achieving that remediation is the object that a techne has in view. And he argues in the Republic for what gets called a strict understanding of techne. And according to this strict understanding, no practitioner of a techne or craft seeks their own benefit, but rather the benefit of the reality upon which they do their work. It may be the case that a practitioner makes money at what they do, but strictly speaking, Socrates argues, this is because they're pursuing another art alongside their techne, which is the art of money making. For Plato, a doctor, for example, insofar as she is a doctor, is interested only in the health of the bodies to which she tends. She is not, according to the strict sense of techne, she is not interested in her paycheck. And while this sounds, in the first instance, a little counterintuitive, I think in some ways we still do see work in this way. You know, we might be alarmed, for example, if a doctor demanded payment before rendering life-saving emergency services to a dying patient. A real doctor, we might say, right? A person who's really concerned with being a doctor shouldn't worry about that, right? That they should practice their art to some degree, irrespective of their ability to make money at it, while granting that in most normal cases, they will, right? For Plato, work is also tied to justice, right? And this, I think, holds true of all the thinkers that I studied in this book. In the same work, The Republic, Plato has Socrates argue ultimately that justice is a kind of doing of one's own job, right? Famously in The Republic, Socrates posits an isomorphism between the soul and the polis, or the community of which the Greek would have been a member. And he argues that the parts of each the parts of the soul and the parts of the city-state, need to be well coordinated in order for justice to reign at the individual and social levels. Now, at first, it might look like he's simply being practical, right? That's sort of expedient to limit each citizen to one kind of work at which each person is expected to be adept and to refrain from meddling in the work of others. But ancient economics really is not at all interested in the maximization of efficiency like we would expect in modern economics. Instead, it becomes apparent that the discipline and focus of the worker, the craftsperson, is the basis of a principle that justice comes about when there are societal incentives to promote the quality and value of work, keeping in mind that work is concerned to secure genuine goods on behalf of those who really need them. So on this view, there's a kind of virtue that seems to pertain to and is even promoted by doing work in a temperate and disciplined way. And a lot of views take it that Greek reflection on techne sees it as sort of value neutral. So part of what I argue in the book is that for Plato, that's not quite right, that there is a kind of built-in conduciveness toward virtue when work is done in the right way. To do one's own job, it turns out, is not just a matter of literal work or the practice of various techni, but also is a clue to how, for this tradition, work is also an internal phenomenon. It's not primarily about a change in the external world. And you'll see sometimes modern attempts to sort of get at a definition of work will emphasize the ways in which work impacts the external world around us. Well, for the pre-modern thinkers, this is not quite true, right? For Plato, to do one's own job is first and foremost to look after the quality of your own soul and to set it in order. And work has a positive influence when it comes to inculcating virtues of various kinds, right? So when we do work, according to Plato and the Platonic tradition, we're working not only on the world, but really on ourselves as well. And I'll just read you one passage from the Republic where Socrates is depicted by Plato as saying the following. He says, "And in truth, justice is, it seems, something of this sort. However, it isn't concerned with someone's doing his own externally, but with what is inside him, with what is truly himself and his own. One who is just does not allow any part of himself to do the work of another part or allow the various classes within himself to meddle with each other. He regulates well what is really his own and rules himself. He puts himself in order, is his own friend, and harmonizes the three parts of himself." And at first in the Republic, Socrates seems to make the claim that we need to work at our own job in order to help us pursue that goal of achieving the virtue that comes from mastering ourselves and putting ourselves in order. And then later he actually changes his emphasis a little bit and says it's actually the practice of work that makes that possible, right? That doing our own job is what promotes virtue, right? So to do one's own job, right, is not just a literal reality about work in the sense of doing a job, but is a kind of clue to what it means to live a life, right? For Plato, the philosopher will also be a practical doer, right? And not just a theorist, right? Not just someone who lives in their head, but someone who lives in the world. And at the very least, philosophy for him is useful for setting the philosopher's individual life in order, and it's productive of moral goodness and even beauty. So this thought about justice and the coordination of workers through dedication to their respective crafts is what allows me to transition to the next topic in the book, which is work in early monasticism, in the early church. The literature here is not systematic, but instead comprises a number of vignettes about the spiritual wisdom and discipline of the great forerunners of monastic practice in Egypt, starting with Anthony, who set the model that found its way through John Cassian and others to continental Europe, where it was codified by Saint Benedict of Nursia. And what I argue is that for about 1,000 years, the monk was really the paradigmatic worker, as well as the paradigmatic spiritual hero in Western literature. The little vignettes that belong to the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers are really quite charming, right? And they picture the heroes of desert monasticism as taking pride in the fact that they depended on no one for the satisfaction of their needs. which they admittedly had reduced to the bare minimum in pursuit of the spiritual life. That pursuit, though, was a lifelong one, and it definitely involved the meeting of basic needs for food and shelter and community. Monastic work is prized in this literature for its ability to meet needs, for its potential to generate alms that could be shared with those who were not able to work or even poorer than the monks themselves, and for its ability to inculcate virtues. The monks chose work that was simple, repetitive, and allowed the mind to be free to engage in prayer, recitation of the Psalms, and to be set aside as needed for worship. So St. Benedict, for example, insisted that monks work, but also that work never be allowed to be an occasion for pridefulness or boasting in the monk's own achievement or artistry. And so he mandated, for instance, that the monks rotate through various tasks in order to prevent becoming too attached to any given form of work, and thus be in danger of allowing it to eclipse in importance prayer and contemplation. In this chapter, I also talk about the only dedicated treatise on work penned by an early Christian author, and that was Augustine, who wrote a short treatise on the work of monks. In this little book, Augustine takes to task a group of monks in his diocese in North Africa who declined to work, citing Jesus' injunction in the Sermon on the Mount to take no thought for the morrow, but to be instead like the birds of the air and lilies of the field, who don't work and yet are provided for by their Heavenly Father. Now, Augustine's book, interestingly, depends very little on the rationales for work provided by the Desert Fathers and Mothers, but instead focuses on making an exegetical case for harmonizing Jesus' Sermon on the Mount with St. Paul's assertion in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 that those who do not work should not eat. By weaving together Jesus and Paul, Augustine shows how we can work for our own needs and to provide charity for others without thereby failing in our duty to take no thought for the morrow. His argument is one that traces of which persist as late as Martin Luther's writings. And it's one that we can work in obedience to Paul while also not depending upon our work as if that were the direct cause of our ability to meet our own needs, but rather upon God to provide for our needs via the agency of our work in cooperation with God's work in the world. I spend some time in Augustine's writings on the book of Genesis, where he develops an account of work as outwardly cooperating with the creative purposes of God, who he says works inwardly through creation to bring about growth, change, and development and progress. Augustine, I think, is also noteworthy for introducing a subjective element for work, right? According to his theology, any kind of work, aside from those pursuits that are outright criminal or sinful, but any kind of work, no matter how lowly in the eyes of the world, is good. And this is consistent with much of his ethics, where the quality of our human pursuits comes down largely to the intention for which they are done. Right? Work for him is a product of love. And he writes memorably in a little treatise on the spiritual disciplines that there is either no weariness in work that is love, or the weariness of work is itself loved, right? So that even work that's difficult, right, can be loved, right, in the right spirit. For Augustine, the value of work does not consist in the esteem with which it is held, which would have been true for much of the pagan world, but instead the value of work comes down to the rightly ordered loves of the person who does the work. And I'll say something about scripture. Paul's injunction in 2 Thessalonians is the most cited verse, I would say, in Christian theological writing on work from the entire Bible. It occurs as early as Athanasius's Life of St. Anthony, and it persists all the way through John Ruskin, at least in the 19th century. The book of Genesis also features very heavily, and I talk about that quite a lot too. The most commonly cited aspect of the Genesis account when it comes to theology of work is the assertion that God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden in order to tend and keep it, or to guard and keep it, depending on the translation. This verse was taken universally in the early church to mean that work was part of God's intended vision for human life from before the fall. And this is really important because some contemporary writers on work have irresponsibly argued that for theology, work is a part of the fall. It's a part of the curse on humanity in response to sin. But this is not the view of the church in the Middle Ages at all. Everyone thought work was part of what human life was supposed to be before the fall. And it's why the monks worked, because they were trying to recreate that pre-lapsarian reality, right? That Garden of Eden experience for humanity. And Adam, before sinning, was supposed to work, right? So I taught this material here at Harvard, and I have to say this is the one thing that surprised students the most. They seemed completely convinced that, according to Christian theology, Adam was supposed to just loaf around in the garden forever, right? But they were alarmed to discover that actually he had a job to do, right? So that's something that we see recurrently throughout medieval literature on philosophy of work as well. That tradition comes to an end in many ways, I argue, with Petrarch, right? The Italian Renaissance humanist, who also, I think, is the first to anticipate some really recognizably modern ideas about work. He made a visit to his brother, who was a Carthusian monk, and in response to that experience, wrote a little book called On Religious Leisure. And in that book, he praises the Carthusian monks for their ability to pursue what he could call a kind of busy leisure. Now, for him, the incipient modern world is a very busy place that affords many distractions. And he thinks that all too often we relieve ourselves from this busyness by falling into the opposite condition, idleness, right? And this is a danger, right? On the one hand, of sort of extreme preoccupation with busyness, and on the other hand, with sort of complete idleness or laziness that we probably recognize in our own world, right? And in our own tendency. Rather than being busy or to the point of distraction, or idle to the point of laziness, Petrarch counsels a kind of busy leisure, a fruitful and productive leisure that yields to constructive and contemplative peace. And here I think he's following in some ways Bernard of Clairvaux, who I'm going to skip over today, but I do talk about in the book, and according to whose teachings, contemplation and work should flow, as it were, back and forth, and sort of weave together in a kind of rhythm. Petrarch is the last person to celebrate the monastic tradition in this way. For him, the monk is still the great worker, and his work is of a piece with his spiritual refinement and self-discipline. Martin Luther is the one who I think breaks this millennial-long tradition by, you might say, laicizing work. For Luther, work is, interestingly, in the sense of doing a job, is a kind of metonym, or a kind of stand-in for works understood as spiritual efforts to earn merit, right? So Luther condemns works righteousness and says that faith instead is what saves us. In the same way, he condemns work as a kind of anxiety-ridden striving for goods that only God really provides. And just as Luther said works should flow from an assured conviction that one's faith has already made one righteous, so too we should do our jobs with peace and assurance that we are steadily doing the tasks that God has called us to do. Luther could be read as radicalizing Augustine's teaching, arguing that every kind of job, no matter how lowly, as long as it is given us to do by God, is good work. Contrary to the medieval tradition, though, the one group of people who for Luther are not working are the monks, the priests, the bishops, all the way up to the Pope, who in his eyes are just lazy, good-for-nothing parasites. Because their office, he says, is one that is not instituted by God, they alone are not working in his sense. In another radicalization of Augustine, he argues that our work is a kind of mask, as he puts it, for God's operations in the world. We must work as a sign of our faith, without presuming that it is our work that is yielding results, but rather relying upon God's agency to deliver what we need through our work. And our work then is a kind of mask, as he puts it, behind which is hidden God's providential hand. The last two figures in the book were, for me, among the more interesting discoveries that I made: John Ruskin and Simone. Ruskin was someone I knew nothing about before writing this book. He's a fascinating figure who turned away from a dazzling career in art criticism to apply himself to social critique. He's a basically conservative thinker who had no use for Karl Marx, but nevertheless shared many of Marx's sort of famous concerns for the poverty and oppression of the working class, which have been brought into a reduced condition by the forces of urbanization and industrialization. Ruskin used his daily readings of Plato and the Bible to mount an impressive moralistic assault on the indifference of a supposedly Christian Britain toward its own poorest citizens. He argued vociferously that we have a responsibility to work and that we have a right to keep the proceeds of our work. But with equal passion, he argued these principles were in practice very rarely observed. Most people, he thought, were not being paid decently for their work. And many rich people were rich without having worked for their money, but rather inherited it or did so-called work in areas like financial speculation that, according to him, was not work at all, but rather leveraging other people's work for your own personal profit. Industrial labor, he condemned as grinding the worker down, shackling him in jobs that produced useless and unnecessary goods at the cheapest possible price. Real work for him meant that you had to train people to excel at their jobs. You had to patiently cultivate them and their abilities. And that meant you couldn't expect mechanical precision and maximum efficiency from real live human beings. Ruskin was at once a capitalist and someone exquisitely sensitive to the harms that capitalism did to the souls of the people who worked under its constraints. One area he encouraged his fellow wealthy Englishmen to be more conscientious of, and this is a lesson I think we can take to heart this way as well today, is on what sorts of things we spend our money on. Expenditure was to him as much a moral concern as production, and so he insisted that if we could spend a little more to support honest and difficult labor, then we should do so in order to encourage good work and its products, rather than exploitative labor and the cheap goods that it produced. As he memorably put it in one of his more widely noticed slogans, the only wealth is life. Finally, my chapter on Simone Weil was also quite a revelation to me. Simone Weil was a mystic and a disillusioned Marxist who called herself a Christian of sorts and a Platonist of sorts. For her, work was the only philosophical problem that the modern world bequeathed to us, the only one that the ancients did not confront. There are only two human activities, according to her, thought and work. And work exists at the point of contact between spirit and matter. Work is formed by a thoughtful intention. It is planned, and it arises when that planned intention confronts material resistance. Work for her is the means by which we overcome that resistance. It is both where necessity and freedom are realized. Necessity, because work contacts the real and responds to it. It runs up against a hard reality. But freedom too, because work realizes some outcome precisely in the resistance of the material. Simone Weil put her own ideas about work to the test and took a series of jobs in factories in order to immerse herself in the condition of the working class. She found modern industrial work grinding and oppressive. In the factory, she thought the basic problem was that there is still thought and action. But uniquely in a modern factory, these two activities are divorced from one another. All the thinking is done by the manager or boss, and all the working is done by the worker. This is the sinister reality of modern factory labor. It robs the worker of the ability to concentrate, to use the mind to solve problems, and to reflect even momentarily on the rewards of a job well done. For her, work is always going to be difficult because it always is contact with resistance. But even modern work, she thought, can find this difficulty consoling. She died tragically young, having penned a book on the future of a reconstructed post-war France, her native country, for which she hoped better things to come on the other side of occupation and devastation by Nazi Germany. But she never lived to see this vision come to pass. In conclusion, I try to suggest some ways that this tradition can help us think about how to hold work in higher esteem. And I said at the beginning that I think it steers between a couple of extremes. One of those extremes we could call workism. You might have read Derek Thompson's piece in The Atlantic called "The Religion of Workism is Killing Us." It's a fascinating article in which he condemns sort of overinflated expectations about work, the hope that it will somehow deliver meaningfulness and meet all of our emotional needs. And I think Platonism will not fall into this error, right? It won't see in work something like the source of all of our needs, right? Or the source of all of our emotional demands for meaningfulness. But I think it also steers between an opposite extreme, which would be something like elitism. And this is the danger to which philosophers are especially susceptible. But according to elitism, we have a tendency to regard work of some forms as being somehow not worth doing or incapable of providing meaningfulness. And I think Platonism will not make that mistake either. We could ask ourselves about our own work in view of the Platonic tradition, which sees it as addressing a genuine need in providing a real good. Some of our jobs perhaps don't meet this very basic minimal requirement. But if our work does do that, then it will always be responsive to reality in some way, and also then submissive to limits, content with what can be brought about with our own disciplined efforts, not motivated by a paycheck or other external inducements. For this tradition, labor is not ultimate, but it is still a way, a characteristically human way, for us to live in reality and perhaps even love it. Thanks very much for your attention. I appreciate your being here and happy to hear any questions that people might have.